So today I'm here to talk to you about some neuropeptides, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about wearable technology, because this is a topic that was supposed to be in this time slot, and Molly Maloof broke her arm, so she was unable to be here. When we developed our company, which is called Apeiron, we wanted to look at something that could identify the human system as a limitless potential. And that's what apeiron means. Apeiron is Greek for limitless. And this is what we look at in human beings. We look at each human being as an N of one. So we biohack essentially every individual that comes to us, whether it's through our medical program or through our coaching program. So biologics. Biologics are a new form of medicine. They've been around for a while, but they're coming on really strong right now. And when we talk about biologics, we're talking about stem cells, we're talking about the peptides, and we're talking about exosomes. Now, I'm not going to spend any time on the stem cells today. Stem cells are kind of in that vague area of we're looking at the possibilities with them. Peptides, on the other hand, are already being used in clinical trials that are showing very positive outcomes, very good safety features when it comes to humans. And exosomes are also fairly new, but they're very exciting in what they do. And the exosomes are pretty impressive with the effects that we're seeing in human systems. So I'm excited to see what happens with that. But think about this. When we talk about biologics, biologics are substances that the body is familiar with. It means that they are proteins, essentially, strings of amino acids that the body understands. And the body responds to biologics instead of reacting to them. Now, what I mean by that is they're very on target. So when we give a biologic, they tend to go in and they tend to do exactly what we expect them to do without much off-target effects. With medications and even with nutraceuticals, we see a lot of off-target effects. So the body is reacting to them rather than responding to them. That's the big difference that we see with these. And this is why I'm so excited about the biologics and what we're seeing in my medical practice with them. So this is kind of a bold statement, but it is something that I believe is actually happening. I think we're going to see these peptides, they're coming on so strong right now that they are going to really overtake the pharmaceutical industry pretty quickly on this too. The rate at which they're coming on, they're not available really from the medical standpoint in Europe in general, but in the United States and in Australia, we have over 70 peptides available for us to use in the medical world. So let's talk about what a peptide actually is. It's basically just a string of amino acids. It's a protein. And the only difference between a protein and a peptide is the number of amino acids, and it's purely nomenclature. But what we're talking about is these strings of amino acids. They'll call them polypeptides or proteins or peptides, but it's all just nomenclature. It's all just a string of amino acids that are there. Now, the body makes tons of peptides, proteins, peptides, whatever you want to call them. And there's even just in the hormonal peptides, the body makes over 50 of these. And we can sequence these in the labs. They're very easy to sequence in general, especially when you get to the shorter versions of them. So this is an insulin peptide. Insulin protein, insulin polypeptide, whatever you want to call it, but it's two strings of amino acids. And you can see how a peptide is actually sequenced is they just string together the amino acids. And as long as you know that sequence, you can create these in the lab. And that's why peptides are inexpensive to manufacture. You just need a peptide sequencer. You need to measure and make sure it's doing exactly what you think it's doing, and you move forward with it. But in general, proteins and peptides are what we call cleotropic, which means they're like this is the growth hormone peptide. And each tissue in the body has a different response to that based on a lock and key mechanism of receptors. So we have these little yellow spots, which would be different areas on there that are different keys for different tissues. So there's one key up here may be the key for fat cells. The other one may be muscle. The other one may be liver. But it's just like the protein is a string of keys. And what we do when we take a peptide is we just take a piece of this protein and we say, we just want this segment with this one key on it. And now we're going to inject that. That's what I'm talking about when I say that we are getting to the point where it is very on target. It's very specific for what we're trying to achieve. You can take pieces of growth hormone and target just cartilage and just say, we want to rejuvenate cartilage without any other effect in the human body. It's pretty amazing how accurate these peptides are. Now today, what I wanted to talk about are the neurologic peptides. These are the ones that we're using in clinical practice right now to really, my practice is more performance model. I don't use in a lot of disease. So what I'm looking at is how do we increase cognitive performance? How do we really substantiate longevity and that using these peptides? So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is more performance medicine, but I'm also going to tell you about some of the areas where these are being used in disease medicine as well. One of the most popular ones that we have is Cerebral Lysin. And Cerebral Lysin is a very interesting mix of peptides that are derived from the pig brain. This is a mix of BDNF, GDNF, CNTF, and NGF. So I know it's a lot of acronyms there. But essentially, Cerebral Lysin is not only a treatment type of peptide, but it's a performance enhancer. And we're seeing outrageous results with this stuff. I mean, it's neuroprotective, promotes cell growth, it improves connections, enhances learning and memory, increases energy and metabolism, decreases beta amyloid. And this is one of the things that we're seeing with its use in Alzheimer's. And it decreases neuroinflammation. So there's a lot of human trials right now on this stuff. And we found that it improves memory and learning. It aids in stroke recovery. They're using it in stroke recovery and TBI in some clinical trials right now. They're also looking at clinical trials in Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease. Anti-anxiety. Now, the interesting thing is they use this to treat ADHD kids, and they found in these 9 to 12-year-olds that 80% of the respondents actually got better with this. And this is typically a four-week injection. So you're doing a subcutaneous injection daily, 5 days a week for 4 weeks. So for 8 weeks. It's 40 injections is the course for this. Now, what we're using it for, and unfortunately I don't have the brain maps to show you, but we map everybody's brain in the practice. You know, I'm not a neurologic practice, but part of human performance is that we get brain maps on everybody. We look at their cognitive function. We look at how they perform in different areas. And we use a lot of neurofeedback, neurostimulation, both AC, DC, and transcranial magnetic stim. But this is what is so fascinating, and I wish I had the maps to show you before and afters, because we have been putting people on Cerebral Lysin and then doing the neurostimulation with these clients. And we do typically twice a day for about 30 minutes for 5 straight days. So we do 10 sessions. And we're seeing responses at such an accelerated rate that used to take us 40 to 50 neurofeedback sessions to achieve the outcomes that we see. But we've also got all these protocols that are very specific for what we're trying to achieve, for better focus, learning and memory, to increase beta, to increase alpha states. So we're able to actually accelerate this whole process using these peptides. And it's not just Cerebral Lysin. We've got other neuropeptides that I'm going to talk about that we're getting very similar results with right now. But Cerebral Lysin has been our go-to. It's a really amazing one to work with. One you may have heard of is Cellink. Cellink is interesting. It's a nasal spray. It's a very small amino acid. I think it's 7 amino acids long. But it is one of the most potent anti-anxiety. They've actually used it in clinical trials with generalized anxiety disorder and found outstanding results with this. Now, the one thing that people have to be aware of is that only 40% of the people who start taking this are going to respond quickly. So what will happen is somebody will get this and they'll do a day or two of the nasal spray and they'll say it didn't have any effect at all. Well, they may be the slow responders and they're going to have to be on this for a week or so before it really kicks in. But when it kicks in, it's really potent. It works really well. Antidepressant, antiviral, improves memory and focus, improve blood flow to the brain. It's similar to a protein that the brain makes called tufsin, and it has an effect on metabolism of serotonin. Dihexane is another one that we use. This was developed out of the University of Washington. And dihexane is a very short peptide as well. I think it's 6 amino acids long. It can be applied in a topical cream, and that's the way we typically use it. But dihexane is amazing for learning and memory. The acceleration of learning and memory with this. They're doing it in clinical trials with Alzheimer's disease, dementia, stroke, and TBI. They're looking at spinal cord injuries and MS with its potential for remyelination of the nervous system. Hearing loss, they've been seeing effects with that and with macular degeneration. But what you're looking at in this graph is the number of dendritic spines on neurons. And this was a laboratory study, but 5 days of stimulation with dihexane versus controls. And you can see how much dendritic change there is. Now, in this slide here, you can actually see the visualization of these dendrites from the neurons growing with this. Dihexane is really good for working with somebody who's learning something new. Like if you're learning to play the guitar or you're learning a new language, doing the dihexane with this, or doing neurostimulation, getting that moving forward. Dihexane is really good with creating that kind of a response. FGL, this is a fairly new one. This is it's an NCAM molecule, so it's a whole new spectrum of what they're using. FGL is being used in clinical trials in Denmark right now. It's in phase 2 clinical trials in a nasal spray. And this is mostly being used right now for stroke recovery and post-traumatic brain injury work. But it's found to substantially reduce neuroinflammation, mobilize neural stem cells, which is interesting. It enhances regeneration and amplifying remyelination. Now, I know some people that have been using this in the United States in MS patients, and they're reporting, and again, this is anecdotal, these are not studies, but they're reporting significant improvements in the MS patients with the remyelination capacity of the FGL. It has been through phase 1 clinical trials, found to be very safe in humans. It comes in a nasal spray as well as a subcutaneous injection, but it's kind of expensive. So the volume that you have to use in a nasal spray is pretty substantial. I mean, we're talking 200 milligrams here, but you're closer to 400 to 600 milligrams in the clinical trials right now. But the subcutaneous injection can be a lot less expensive in that regard. Now, I threw in RG3 here. RG3 is not really a peptide. RG3 is a ginsenoside derivative, but it's such a potent brain molecule that I wanted to add this in here. RG3 is a nasal spray, and it really affects PGC1A activation. And so what it essentially does is it mimics exercise. You do this nasal spray, and you can see what happens with PPAR-GC1A activity relative to exercise. You almost get the same response of PPAR-GC1A. Relative protein levels of NRF2, NQO1 catalase, and MNSOD. These are all kind of the body's ability to manage free radicals. So upregulation of all of these is really a beneficial aspect. And you can see with the RG3, you're actually getting greater activation of some of these than you get with exercise. Now, we've always known the benefits of exercise on the brain and everything, but this is pretty impressive. Now, we also saw here with NRF1 and TFAM, which are really more longevity markers. So AMP-K is a longevity activator. mTOR you want suppressed. So all of these things are showing improvements in longevity. So this is part of our longevity protocol, is putting people on the RG3. And it's simple to use, it's inexpensive, it's a nasal spray. Melanotan II. How many of you have heard of Melanotan II? Yeah, several of you. It's mostly used for people who want to get a tan. You can get a tan, a full summer tan in about 3 days with about 40 minutes of sun exposure a day. And it'll last for 4 months. It's wonderful. It activates melanocytes. But there is a huge neurologic component to MT2 as well. MT2 stimulates alpha MSH in the brain, and alpha MSH has been implicated in a lot of aspects of the symptoms of chronic Lyme disease, of chronic mold exposure, and all of that. So in the US, a lot of us in the functional realms are using this to help people get over that chronic inflammatory response syndrome that occurs. It really activates the melanocortin 4 receptors, melanocortin 3, it decreases nitric oxide, TNF alpha and interleukin 6, increases IL-10, which is anti-inflammatory, and it may increase nerve growth factor in the cholinergic pathway. The other ones that we use in the brain, thymosin alpha-1, thymosin beta-4, thymolin, BPC-157, and Cmax. I could go all day on some of these. The ones that I mentioned are the primary ones that we're using. We still use a lot of thymosin alpha-1, thymosin beta-4, and BPC. We mostly use for soft tissue recovery and repair, but great nootropics, especially post-traumatic brain injury. I did want to give you guys access to this. Now, go to www.321peptides.com. And you can get the peptide guide that I created. 321 Tribe will actually take you to enrollment in one of our epigenetic training courses. But if you want the peptide guide, go to 321peptides.com. Data-driven health. So rule is, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And this is where we are right now in health. We do this in our medical centers. We do this with our coaches. We train people how to use wearable data. Most of you are probably familiar with Dexcom. Dexcom gives us access to watch a person's blood sugars. Now, in my medical practice, what I do is I actually creep on my patients. I look at their data every week. I look at their stress, I look at their sleep, I look at their activity levels, I look at their resting heart rates, I look at their glucose if they're measuring with a Dexcom. So all of this stuff is giving me instant feedback on what we're doing with each client. And everything we do, we measure it and we manage it. I don't put anybody on anything without knowing what I'm measuring. I've got to have a measurement for that. I am not okay with saying, let's try this and see how you feel. I want to know how you feel, but I also want to know what the data is telling me. We saw this with Fitbit. Fitbit had 150 billion hours with 10 million users. And they found that with weekly activity minutes, resting heart rate came down pretty dramatically in people. I mean, that is very impressive to see this data. This is new data that's out. Resting heart rate with sleep. Now, this was interesting because we've always heard 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep is ideal. But if you look at 7.5 to 8 hours, you're on the upslope of the heart rate curve. So ideally, it looks like 6.5 to 7.5, with 7 being the sweet spot. Kind of surprised me when I saw this, but seeing that resting heart rate made me want to look more into what we were seeing with that. Now, in our medical practice, we recommend the Oura Ring, the BioStrap, or the Garmin Fenix watch. Now, that's what I'm wearing. And I put most of my clients on the Garmin Fenix. This is the Fenix Mark Athlete, but the Fenix 6 is what we use currently. And this uses a lot of the algorithms from FirstBeat technology. FirstBeat out of Finland. I'm going to give a kudos to Finland because I think FirstBeat technology is probably the top biometric measurement and algorithm company out there right now. The other ones that can be used, the Fitbit, the Apple Watch, Garmin, Oura Ring, BioStrap, Hilo, Whoop. Most of the ones that don't have an API, I don't recommend, because right now we're building platforms. We're seeing platforms that have APIs that will draw this data off. And the reason you want to have this stuff is that the human system is adaptable. So we have a familiar zone that we function in. And in order to grow, we need to get uncomfortable. And what that means is we need to get out of that zone of familiarity. This is stress. This is good stress. It's when we exercise, we get into a zone that's unfamiliar to us. The body has to adapt, and this is epigenetics. This is where gene expression actually changes to adapt, because our genetics, our DNA is the most fascinating stuff. What it does is it's constantly assessing environment and our function in that environment, and it's saying, are we ideally set to live in this environment? And when you give it an unfamiliar environment, it has to change. It's like when you lose 20 pounds from doing diet and exercise, going from being sedentary. So in 3 months, you lose 20 pounds. 3 months later, you're doing the same thing and you haven't lost any weight. Well, what's happened? What happened is that familiar zone moved. After you give enough stress time getting out of the familiar zone, the body adapts. The gene expression changes, the familiar zone moves up. And suddenly you have to be doing more. Now, this is what I loved about the Garmin watch is it has this thing called training load in it. So it actually pushes me because it changes my familiar zone. This zone kept going up. I was training for a Spartan race, and the familiar zone kept changing on me. So I had to work harder every week or so to get into a zone of growth. But it gave me that kind of feedback, which I loved. This is the algorithm it uses for stress. And I like this because it doesn't give you HRV in the standard measure. Stress is an easy score to look at, but it's essentially HRV. Now, this is a typical day for me up top, and you can see about a stress score of 15. Down below was me having a glass of alcohol. And so you can see how the stress level changed from one glass of wine. After I saw this data, I started paying attention to it, and it happened every time I'd have a glass of wine. So what I did is I changed my ways. This is me traveling to Europe from Austin, Texas. I don't travel well, and I'm trying to figure out how to get this fixed, but stress level of 60 is off the charts for me. But what happened is, this was, over here on this side of the graph was Thursday. This was me actually coming back from a 3-day trip to London. My resting heart rate was 60, or my stress level was 60, I'm sorry. And then over the course of 7 days, my stress level got down to 4. But it took me 7 days to fully recover that stress level. Now, I also saw this in resting heart rate, which my resting heart rate typically runs around 53, 54. But I had gotten up to about 65 on that first day back, and you can see the resting heart rate changed. This is why it's so important to have these measurements. This is over the course of 12 months. You can see that my stress level was really up around 45, March through June of 2017, I think it was. And then all of a sudden it plummeted. So what happened in June that carried through October for me? One of the things I found is I went on growth hormone releasing hormone. And that was the thing that had the most substantial effect on my stress levels. So there's ways to actually measure when we're doing these different peptides and things like that. This is what's really cool about wearable technology. So we have the ability to measure these things. Sleep. You can see that sleep, this is interesting too, because you remember that graph I was showing you about 7 hours of sleep being ideal? You can see when I dipped to 7 hours of sleep was June through August. And that was when my stress level came down too. So is this more ideal? I don't know. But these are correlations that we're starting to see. But, you can see generally I sleep fairly well. I sleep on average about 7.5 hours a night. Here's a new metric that Garmin just added. Again, a first beat technology algorithm, which they call the body battery. I absolutely love this. I'm just learning this because they just added it. But over here, you can see what happens across a week or so with the body battery. It recharges at night, and then these things that impact it. And you can start looking at things like they say here, a glass of drinking alcohol, metabolizing alcohol, taking a nap. So you can start to actually get feedback from your system on what's happening. A new one that we're getting ready to try out is an Exposo Monitoring, looking at UV exposure, pollution, pollen, heat, humidity. I live in Austin, Texas. This is really important for me. It's sunny all the time. There's a lot of pollen in the air. There's a lot of UV. There's a lot of heat and humidity. So this will be something that I'm going to start monitoring and seeing how this works. All right, so this is the end of the wearable technology piece, and thank you for your time.
So we have a little time here. Okay. I have a question for you. I work with food. I'm a journalist, and that's like my scene, what we should eat. So if I went to the food store with you to choose one thing, what would be the best thing that I could put in my mouth?
The best thing? One food?
One food. If I would have to go, to this ancient island and have just one thing with me, what would be like nutritious-wise the best?
Salmon.
Okay. Why?
Well, you're getting good quality protein. You're getting a good healthy dose of omega-3s in there. Good mix of fats in general. So I think salmon is probably one of the most perfect foods.
If I was a vegan?
If you were a vegan, I would probably recommend that you go to the supplement aisle and get a bunch of supplements.
Really?
Yeah. I work with vegetarians, typically not so much vegans, but I work with vegetarians. And, I don't have a specific dietary pattern that I recommend for people. I identify individual needs for people. And with vegetarians, the things we look at is they need a source of heme iron. They need L-carnitine. They need choline. They need B12. They need B6. These are just some simple things that you can supplement and create a very healthy body response with a vegetarian diet that's missing some of the components that you could be getting.
Thank you so much.
All right.